The wolf's blood had soaked through Ethan Quinlan's coat by the time he heard the heavy footsteps on his porch, and when he stumbled to the door with his rifle in hand, half asleep and wholly terrified, he found an orc woman standing in the pre-dawn darkness with the dead beast at her feet. "It was near your sheep," she said, her voice low and rough, her breath fogging in the cold mountain air. Ethan stared at her, then at the wolf, then back at her. The lantern light from inside his cabin cast her in shades of gold and shadow, illuminating the green of her skin, the small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw, the pointed tips of her ears poking through dark hair braided close to her skull. She wore leather and fur, practical clothing for the wilderness, and her hands were still bloody from dragging the animal across half a mile of rocky terrain. "You killed it," Ethan managed, lowering his rifle slightly but not setting it aside. His heart hammered in his chest. Orcs did not come to human homesteads, not peacefully, not in his experience, and certainly not in the stories he had grown up hearing. "Yes," she did not elaborate. Her dark eyes met his without flinching, without the aggression he had expected, but also without warmth. She looked tired, he realized, exhausted actually in a way that went deeper than a single night of hunting. "Why?" The question came out harder than he intended. "Because it was hunting your sheep," she repeated, as if speaking to someone very slow. "And if you lost your flock, you would starve, and then you would leave, and then more humans would come looking for what happened to you, and then my valley would be full of soldiers instead of one quiet shepherd." The logic was so blunt and practical that Ethan found himself almost laughing, except nothing about this situation was funny. He was standing in his doorway in his nightshirt and boots, holding a rifle aimed at a woman who had apparently saved his livelihood for entirely selfish reasons, and the sun was not even up yet. "I should thank you then," he said carefully. She shrugged, a very human gesture that somehow looked different on her broader shoulders. "You should burn the carcass. More wolves will come for the scent of blood." She turned to leave. "Wait." The word came out before Ethan could think better of it. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "What's your name?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, as if deciding it cost her nothing, she answered. "Ragna. I am Ethan. I know, you talk to your sheep." There might have been the faintest hint of amusement in her voice, but her face remained impassive. Then she walked down the porch steps and disappeared into the trees before the first light of dawn could touch the sky. Ethan stood there for several minutes, watching the space where she had vanished, before he finally set down his rifle and looked at the dead wolf on his porch. It was massive, easily the largest he had seen in his 3 years on this remote homestead. Its jaws were open in a permanent snarl, revealing teeth that could have torn through flesh and bone with ease. Ragna had killed it with what looked like a single strike to the throat, clean and efficient. He dragged it off the porch himself, his muscles burning with the effort, and built a fire as she had suggested. While the carcass burned and the sun finally rose over the mountains, Ethan checked on his sheep and found them nervous but unharmed, huddled together in the far corner of their pen. He counted them twice to be sure, then stood with his hands on the fence railing and wondered what exactly had just happened. The sensible part of his mind, the part that had served in the border wars and knew what orcs were capable of, told him to be cautious. To report this to the nearest settlement, perhaps, though that was a 3-day ride and he had no proof beyond a dead wolf and a story that sounded half-mad even to himself. The other part, the part that had chosen this isolated life precisely because he was tired of violence and fear and suspicion, told him that Ragna had helped him and asked for nothing in return. He chose to be cautious but not cruel. He would keep his rifle closer, sleep lighter, but he would not ride for help based on an act of kindness, however strange its source. 3 nights later, he heard the wolves again. This time he was ready, rifle loaded and positioned by the window that faced the sheep pen. But when he peered out into the darkness, he saw a figure already moving between the trees, quick and low to the ground. Moonlight caught on green skin and the glint of a blade, and then Ragna was among the wolves, moving with a speed and ferocity that made Ethan's breath catch. There were 4 of them this time, a full pack, and they scattered as she attacked, but she was faster. She brought down 2 before they could flee, and the other 2 vanished into the forest with their tails between their legs. The entire fight lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Ethan grabbed his coat and went outside, not bothering with the rifle this time. Ragna was breathing hard when he reached her, wiping her blade clean on the grass. She looked up at his approach but did not move away. "You are making a habit of this," he said, aiming for lightness and not quite achieving it. "They are making a habit of coming here." She straightened, sheathing her knife. "Something is driving them down from the high peaks. I do not know what yet. You live up there," she nodded. "In the old caves 2 valleys north, alone." She added the last word as if anticipating his next question. "I should pay you," Ethan said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "For your help, I have some coin or food or no." The refusal was flat, immediate. "I do not want your charity, human." The word stung more than it should have. "It is not charity. You are protecting my home. I am protecting my peace." Ragna turned to face him fully, and in the moonlight her expression was fierce. "If your sheep die, humans come. If humans come, they hunt. If they hunt, they find me. If they find me, I have to kill them or leave, and I am tired of both." She paused, and something in her face shifted, became almost vulnerable. "I am tired of moving." Ethan understood that kind of tired. He had felt it himself, in the years after the war, when every town and city felt too loud, too full of people who wanted to talk about battles and bravery, and did not understand that all he wanted was silence and space to breathe. "Then let me help you," he said. "If something is driving the wolves down, we should find out what it is, together." Ragna stared at him as if he had suggested they sprout wings and fly. "You want to help me. You have helped me twice now. It seems only fair." "Fair." She tested the word like it was foreign. "Human, do you know what your people do to mine? What they would do to you if they knew you were speaking to me like this, as if we are equals?" "I know." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "I also know that you could have let the wolves take my sheep, or taken them yourself for that matter, and instead you have killed 5 wolves in as many days to keep them safe. That seems to count for something." For a long moment, Ragna was silent. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "I will think about it." And she left, taking the dead wolves with her, leaving Ethan standing alone in his pasture with more questions than answers. He did not see her for a week after that. The wolves did not return either, and Ethan found himself watching the tree line at dusk, wondering if she was still out there or if his offer had driven her away entirely. He told himself it did not matter, that he should be grateful for the peace and the safety of his flock, but he found his thoughts returning to her again and again. To the exhaustion in her voice when she spoke of being tired of moving, to the competence with which she fought, to the strange, prickly honor that made her refuse payment, but accept the logic of mutual survival. On the 8th day, he woke to find a haunch of venison hanging from his porch railing, butchered with expert precision and wrapped in clean cloth. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but Ethan knew. He took the meat inside and prepared it carefully, making a stew that would last him several days, and when he ate it that evening, he saved a portion in a covered bowl and left it on the porch with a skin of his best wine and a simple message scratched on a piece of bark. "Thank you." The offer stands." The next morning, the bowl and skin were gone. 3 days later, Ragna appeared at his door just after sunset, her face grim. "Something is wrong in the high peaks," she said without preamble. "I have been scouting. There are more wolves than there should be, and they are moving wrong." Erratic, frightened, Ethan stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "Frightened of what? I do not know. I need to go higher into the old territories. It will take several days." She hesitated, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. "I came to tell you so you would be ready. Keep your rifle close. Bar your doors at night. If I do not return in 6 days, assume the worst and leave, or I could come with you." The words were out before he could second-guess them. Ragna's eyes widened. "That is a foolish idea." "Probably," Ethan agreed. "But you said yourself something is wrong. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1, and I was a tracker during the war. I know how to move quietly and how to survive in rough country. You were a soldier." It was not a question, and her tone was flat, guarded. "Yes, on the border campaigns." He did not flinch from it. "I have fought orcs before, Ragna. I will not lie to you about that. But I also left the army and came here because I was sick of fighting. Sick of killing people I did not know over land and pride and politics I did not care about." He took a breath. "You have shown me more honor in 2 weeks than most of my fellow soldiers showed in 2 years. If you need help, I am offering it." She studied him for a long time, her dark eyes searching his face for something he could not name. Finally, she said, "If you slow me down, I will leave you behind." "Fair enough. If we encounter other orcs, you will do exactly as I say without question." "Agreed. And if you betray me, I will kill you myself. I would expect nothing less." Ethan held out his hand, a human gesture of agreement. After a moment, Ragna took it, her grip strong and calloused and warm. "When do we leave?" "Before dawn. Bring supplies for 7 days. Warm clothing. Your rifle and as much ammunition as you can carry." She released his hand and turned to go, then paused. "And Ethan, tell no one about this. If your kind find out you are helping me, they will name you traitor and worse." "I know," he said quietly. "I have no one to tell anyway." Something shifted in her expression, too quick to read, and then she was gone into the gathering darkness. Ethan spent the evening preparing, packing his old military rucksack with jerky, hardtack, a waterskin, flint and steel, rope, a bedroll, and extra powder and shot for his rifle. He dressed in layers, wool and leather that would keep him warm in the high altitudes, and tried not to think too hard about what he was doing. He was about to venture into orc territory with an orc woman he barely knew, chasing a mystery that might get them both killed, and he could not bring himself to feel anything but a strange, fierce anticipation. Perhaps he had been alone on this mountain for too long. Or perhaps, he thought as he checked his rifle one last time, he was finally doing something that felt right in a way nothing had since the war ended. Ragna arrived an hour before dawn, moving so silently that he did not hear her until she knocked on his door. She carried a pack of her own, larger than his and strapped with additional weapons: a bow, a long knife, a small axe. She wore her dark hair loose now, falling past her shoulders, and her green skin seemed to absorb the shadows around her, making her almost invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," Ethan confirmed, shouldering his pack and taking up his rifle. They moved north into the mountains, following trails that Ethan would never have found on his own. Ragna set a brutal pace, but true to his word, he kept up, his old military training serving him well even after years of soft living. They did not speak much at first, both of them focused on the climb and the terrain. But as the sun rose and the land around them grew wilder and more remote, Ethan found himself stealing glances at her. She moved through the wilderness like she was part of it, reading signs in the landscape that he could barely see: a broken branch here, a disturbed patch of moss there, the faint trace of a scent on the wind. She was, he realized, utterly in her element out here, confident and capable in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he did not want to examine too closely. They stopped at midday to eat and rest, perching on a rocky outcrop that overlooked 3 valleys and a sweep of pine forest that seemed to go on forever. Ethan shared his jerky with her, and she accepted it with a small nod of thanks, chewing thoughtfully as she scanned the horizon. "How long have you lived up here?" he asked, breaking the silence. 5 years. She did not look at him. "Before that I traveled. Before that I was with my clan." "What happened?" Her jaw tightened. "I spoke against a raid. We were going to attack a human village, burn their crops, take their livestock. It was petty and cruel, and I said so. My chief said I was weak, soft, too sympathetic to the enemy." She took a drink from her water skin, her movements deliberate. "So I left before he could cast me out and make a show of it. I have been alone since." "I am sorry," Ethan said, and meant it. Ragna glanced at him, surprise flickering across her face. "Why, you are human. My clan would have hurt your people. Because you were punished for having a conscience. That is not fair, no matter who is involved." He hesitated, then added, "I left the army for similar reasons. We were ordered to burn an orc village to the ground, civilians included. Women, children. I refused. My commanding officer called me a coward, but he was too short on men to court-martial me, so he just made my life miserable until my term of service ended." He looked out at the forest, the old bitterness rising in his throat. "I think about that village sometimes. Wonder if someone else carried out the order after I left." "Probably," Ragna said, her voice soft. "That is the way of war. Someone always carries out the order." They sat in silence for a while after that, a silence that felt less awkward than companionable, born of shared disillusionment and the strange understanding that can only exist between 2 people who have walked away from the same kind of darkness. When they set off again, Ragna's pace was slightly slower, and she pointed out landmarks as they passed a lightning-struck tree that marked the boundary of her territory, a spring where the water was safe to drink, a cave she had sheltered in during a storm the previous winter. Ethan listened and learned, and tried not to notice the way his heart beat a little faster whenever she looked at him. They made camp that night in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines, building a fire small enough to avoid drawing attention but large enough to keep the cold at bay. Ethan set up his bedroll on one side of the fire, and Ragna took the other, both of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent plenty of nights sleeping rough. "I will take first watch," Ragna said, settling cross-legged with her bow across her knees. "Wake me in 4 hours," Ethan replied, lying down and pulling his blanket up to his chin. The ground was hard and the air was cold, but he had slept in worse conditions. Still, he found himself reluctant to close his eyes, too aware of Ragna's presence across the fire, the way the flames cast her features in sharp relief. "You should sleep, Ethan." Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Tomorrow will be harder." He closed his eyes. "Ragna, thank you for trusting me enough to bring me along." A pause. Then, so soft he almost missed it, "Thank you for offering." He fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the pines and the faint crackle of the fire, and did not dream. The next 2 days were a blur of climbing and scouting, pushing higher into the mountains where the air grew thin, and the trees gave way to stone and ice. They saw more signs of the wolves' tracks, scat, the remains of kills, but the animals themselves stayed out of sight, which Ragna said was unusual. Wolves were bold creatures, especially in their own territory. For them to be this skittish meant something was very wrong. On the third day they found the first body. It was a wolf, but not like any wolf Ethan had ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of a normal animal, with patchy fur and foam dried around its muzzle. Its eyes were open and glassy, and its lips were pulled back in a rictus of agony. Ragna crouched beside it, her face grim. "Disease," she said, pointing to the swollen glands in its neck and the discoloration of its gums. "This is what has been driving them down. They are fleeing the sickness." "Can it spread to other animals?" Ethan asked, keeping his distance. "To livestock?" "To people? I do not know. I am not a healer." She stood, wiping her hands on her trousers. "But if it is spreading through the wolf population, it will only get worse. We need to find the source." They found it the next day, high in a box canyon that reeked of death and rot. There were dozens of wolf carcasses here, piled in the narrow space where the sick animals had come to die. The smell was overwhelming, and Ethan had to cover his nose and mouth with a cloth just to breathe. Ragna moved through the carnage with grim determination, examining the bodies, checking the surrounding terrain. "There," she said finally, pointing to a dark opening in the canyon wall. "A den. This must have been where it started." They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, but the den was empty save for more dead wolves and a clutch of rotting meat that had clearly been the source of the infection. Some fool hunter, orc or human, had left poisoned bait in the wolves' own territory, and it had done its work too well, creating a plague that had spread through the pack and driven them into a frenzy of hunger and fear. "We need to burn it," Ragna said, her voice tight with fury. "All of it. The den, the bodies, everything. If we do not, the sickness will spread to other predators and eventually to prey animals and then to livestock," Ethan finished, "and from there to people." They worked through the rest of the day and into the night, building pyres and hauling carcasses, and soaking everything with oil that Ragna had brought for just such a purpose. It was grim, exhausting work, and by the time they finally set the fires and watched the flames consume the infected den, both of them were filthy and bone-tired and silent with the weight of what they had found. They camped downwind of the fires that night, too exhausted to go any farther. Ragna sat staring into their small cookfire with a look of such weariness that Ethan finally moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You saved a lot of lives today," he said quietly. "Human and orc alike. This would have spread far if you had not tracked it down." "I should have found it sooner," she said, her voice rough. "I knew something was wrong. I should have. You did everything you could." Ethan cut her off gently. "You cannot blame yourself for not knowing the future, Ragna. You found it. You stopped it. That is what matters." She turned to look at him, and in the firelight, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why do you care?" she asked, and there was something raw and vulnerable in her voice that made his chest ache. "You do not know me. I am nothing to you. Why do you care what I feel or what I blame myself for?" Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time since they had met, he let himself be completely honest. "Because you are not nothing to me," he said. "I do not know when it happened, but somewhere between you dragging a dead wolf onto my porch, and now I started to care about you. Not as some strange orc woman who keeps saving my sheep. As you, Ragna, who left her clan because she had a conscience, who lives alone in the mountains because she is tired of fighting, who works herself to exhaustion to protect a valley that is not even hers because it is the right thing to do." He took a breath. "You are brave and strong and honorable, and I care about you because I would be a fool not to." Ragna stared at him, her expression shifting through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been hope before settling on guarded wariness. "You should not say things like that." "Why not? They are true." Because we are enemies, Ethan. Our people have been at war for generations. Because even if we were not, you are human and I am orc, and there is no world where that ends well for either of us. Her voice cracked slightly. Because I am tired of losing things I care about, and I will not let myself care about you only to lose you too. You will not lose me, Ethan said and reached for her hand. She did not pull away, and he took that as permission to continue. I am not going anywhere, Ragna. I live on that mountain by choice, and I am choosing to be here with you now. I am choosing to care about you, consequences and all. You are a fool, she whispered, but her fingers tightened around his. Probably. He smiled, small and sad. But I have been called worse. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped and shoulders touching, while the fires burned down to embers behind them and the stars wheeled overhead. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and they lay down side by side, still holding hands, and fell asleep to the sound of each other's breathing. When Ethan woke the next morning, Ragna was already up, packing her gear with quick, efficient movements. She did not look at him as he stirred, and her face was carefully blank in a way that made his stomach sink. Ragna, he started, but she cut him off. We should head back, she said, her tone brisk and impersonal. The fires will burn for another day at least, but there is nothing more we can do here. Your sheep will need tending, and I have been away from my own territory too long. Ethan sat up slowly, watching her. Are we going to talk about last night? There is nothing to talk about. She slung her pack over her shoulders and finally met his eyes, and her expression was so carefully neutral it hurt. You said things. I said things. We were tired and emotional. It does not change anything. It changes everything, Ethan said quietly, getting to his feet, at least for me. Then you are even more foolish than I thought. She turned away, adjusting the straps on her pack. Come, the journey back will be faster than the journey here. She was right about that, at least. They made excellent time retracing their route, and Ragna pushed the pace hard enough that there was little breath for conversation. Ethan did not push her, sensing that she needed space to think, but he also did not let her withdraw completely. He stayed close, offered to share his food at mealtimes, quietly pointed out things he thought she might find interesting: a hawk's nest, a particularly fine view, a patch of wildflowers growing improbably from a crack in a boulder. By the second day, her walls had started to come down again. She began answering his questions with more than monosyllables. And once, when he slipped on a patch of loose scree, she reached out to steady him without thinking, her hand warm and sure on his arm. They reached Ethan's homestead on the evening of the 6th day, the cabin looking small and lonely in the fading light. The sheep were fine, bleating their greetings as Ethan checked on them, and there were no signs of wolves or any other disturbances. It should have been a relief, but instead Ethan felt a strange reluctance settling over him. Because now they were back and Ragna would leave, and he had no idea when or if he would see her again. She seemed to be thinking the same thing because she lingered on his porch after they had unloaded their packs, her hands shoved in her pockets and her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. Thank you, she said finally, for coming with me. I would have managed alone, but it was easier with you there. I am glad I could help. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, trying to read her face. Will I see you again? Ragna was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully she said, do you want to? Yes, he did not hesitate. Very much. She finally looked at him, and the vulnerability in her eyes made his breath catch. I am afraid, she admitted, so softly he almost missed it. I am afraid that if I keep seeing you, I will want things I cannot have. I will start to hope for things that are impossible. And when it ends badly, as it surely will, it will break me in a way I am not sure I can survive. Ethan crossed the porch to stand in front of her, close enough to touch but not quite touching. "What if it does not end badly?" he asked. "What if we are careful and smart and just try? See what happens." "Nothing good has ever come from an orc and a human trying, Ethan." "Then maybe it is time something did." He reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingertips grazed the pointed tip of her ear, and she shivered. "I am not asking you to move in or marry me tomorrow, Ragna. I am just asking you to come back. Visit. Let me cook you dinner. Talk with me. Let us be friends at least, and see where it goes from there." She closed her eyes, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. "Friends," she repeated, as if testing the word. Then her eyes opened, and there was a spark of something that might have been mischief in their depths. "I have never had a human friend before." "I have never had an orc friend before," Ethan replied, smiling. "We can figure it out together." "You are impossible," she said, but she was smiling too, small and tentative. "Very well, I will come back. But if your neighbors find out and come with torches and pitchforks, I am leaving you to deal with them." "Fair enough." He held out his hand. "Friends?" Ragna took it, her grip firm and warm. "Friends," she agreed. Then, before he could say anything else, she stepped back and off the porch in one smooth motion. 3 days. I will come in the evening." "I will be here," Ethan promised, and watched as she disappeared into the trees, moving like a shadow until she was gone. 3 days later, as the sun set and painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Ragna emerged from the forest and walked up to Ethan's door. He had been watching for her, and he opened the door before she could knock, grinning like a fool. "You came," he said, unable to keep the delight out of his voice. "I said I would." She stepped inside, looking around the small cabin with unconcealed curiosity. It was a simple space, one main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area curtained off in the corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies. But it was clean and warm and clearly well cared for, and Ragna found herself relaxing slightly as she took it in. "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing to the table. "I made stew. It is not fancy, but it is hot and filling." They ate together, the conversation starting awkward and gradually becoming easier as they fell into the rhythm they had found on the mountain. Ragna told him about her week, the repairs she had made to her cave dwelling, the deer she had tracked for 2 days before finally bringing it down. Ethan talked about his sheep, the fence he was mending, the book he was reading about crop rotation, even though he had no crops to speak of. It was domestic and ordinary and completely bizarre given who and what they were, and Ethan found himself happier than he had been in years. As the evening wore on and the fire burned low, Ragna made no move to leave, and Ethan did not ask her to. They migrated from the table to the space in front of the fireplace, sitting on the floor with their backs against the furniture, sharing a bottle of honey mead that Ethan had been saving for a special occasion. "Tell me something about yourself," Ragna said eventually, her voice slightly hazy from the alcohol. "Something you have not told anyone else." Ethan thought for a moment. "I wanted to be a scholar," he said finally, "before the war. I wanted to study history and languages, and travel to libraries, and write boring academic papers that 3 people would read." He laughed, self-deprecating. "Instead, I became a soldier and then a shepherd, and I do not regret it exactly, but sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had been born in a different time, a peaceful time." Ragna nodded slowly. "I wanted to be a builder," she confessed. "My clan, we moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to create anything permanent, but I always loved making things. Furniture, tools, structures. I used to imagine building a real home, something solid and lasting with rooms for different purposes and windows that let in the light. She gestured vaguely. Foolish dreams for an orc. Not foolish, Ethan said firmly. You should build something. You have the time and the skill. Why not? Because I am one person and building takes resources and labor and time that I do not have. But she sounded thoughtful rather than dismissive. Although there is good stone in my valley and timber, I suppose I could start small, a better shelter than the cave, something weatherproof and warm. I could help, Ethan offered. I am not a builder, but I can follow instructions and lift heavy things. Ragna looked at him, and her expression was soft in the firelight. You would do that. Spend your days helping me build a house that you will never live in. Why not? You spent days helping me track down a disease that was not your responsibility. Friends help each other, right? Friends, Ragna repeated, and there was something complicated in her voice. She set down her cup and shifted to face him more fully. Ethan, I need to be honest with you. I am not sure I can be just your friend. His heart stuttered in his chest. What do you mean? I mean that every time I see you, it gets harder to leave. I mean that I think about you when I am alone in my cave, wonder what you are doing, whether you are safe. I mean that when you touched my face the other day, I wanted to lean into it and never pull away. She took a shaky breath. I am trying to protect myself, to keep my distance, but you make it very difficult. Ethan reached out slowly and took her hand, threading their fingers together. Then stop trying, he said softly. Stop protecting yourself from me. I am not going to hurt you, Ragna. I am not going to leave you or betray you or make you regret trusting me. I promise you that. You cannot promise that, she whispered. You do not know what will happen. No one does. You are right. I do not know what will happen. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, feeling her shiver at the touch. But I know how I feel right now, and I know that I want to be with you, not as friends, as more, if you will have me. Ragna closed her eyes, and a single tear escaped to track down her green cheek. This is a terrible idea, probably the worst. Ethan smiled, aching and hopeful. Is that a yes? She opened her eyes and looked at him, and this time there was no guardedness, no walls, just raw emotion and want and fear and hope all tangled together. Yes, she said. Yes, you impossible, foolish human. Yes. Ethan did not remember moving, but suddenly he was kissing her, or she was kissing him, and it did not matter who started it because they were finally closing the distance that had been between them since the beginning. Her lips were warm and slightly chapped, and her tusks pressed gently against his face, and she tasted like honey mead and hope. They broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, and Ragna let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. What are we doing? She asked, resting her forehead against his. Something terrifying and wonderful, Ethan replied, cupping her face in his hands. Together. She kissed him again, slower this time, and when they finally settled back against the furniture, she tucked herself against his side and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stayed like that until the fire burned down to ash and the night grew cold. Ragna did not leave that night. Or the next. She stayed at the cabin for 3 days, and they fell into an easy routine that felt startlingly domestic, waking together, making breakfast, tending the sheep, working on small projects around the homestead, cooking dinner, talking late into the night before falling asleep in each other's arms. It was not without its awkward moments. Ragna was not used to sharing space with someone else, and Ethan had to learn to read her moods, to recognize when she needed quiet or distance. They had their first real argument on the second day. A stupid disagreement about the best way to store firewood that escalated because both of them were on edge, unused to navigating the vulnerability of a new relationship. But they worked through it, apologized, and learned from it, And Ethan thought that maybe that was what mattered most, not that they never struggled, but that they were willing to struggle together. On the fourth day, Ragna announced that she needed to return to her own territory, and Ethan did not protest, even though his chest ached at the thought of her leaving. They were building something fragile and precious, and it would not survive if they tried to force it or cling too tightly. "I will come back," she promised, standing on his porch with her pack slung over her shoulder. "A few days. A week at most. I will be here," Ethan said, and kissed her goodbye, soft and lingering. True to her word, Ragna returned 5 days later, and the pattern continued. She would come to the cabin, stay for a few days, then return to her own territory before coming back again. Slowly, over the course of weeks and then months, the space between visits grew shorter, and the visits themselves grew longer. She started keeping some of her belongings at the cabin: a spare set of clothes, her favorite knife, a small carving she had made of a raven. Ethan cleared space on his shelves for her things and built a second chair for the table, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They also began working on her house. It started small, with Ethan accompanying Ragna to her valley to help her clear a site and lay a foundation. But as the project grew, so did their investment in it, and they fell into a rhythm of spending half their time at Ethan's cabin and half at Ragna's valley, working on the house during the day and sleeping in her cave at night. The house took shape slowly, built from stone and timber and sweat and stubbornness. Ragna proved to be an excellent builder, her hands sure and strong as she shaped the wood and fitted the stones. Ethan learned from her, his respect and admiration growing with every day they worked side by side. By the time summer turned to autumn and the leaves began to change, the walls were up and the roof was half finished, and the house was starting to look like something real and permanent. It was during one of these building days, as they took a break to eat lunch and admire their progress, that Ragna said something that changed everything. "I want you to live here with me," she said abruptly, not looking at him. "When it is finished, I want this to be our home, not just mine." Ethan set down his bread, his heart pounding. "Are you sure?" "No," she laughed, nervous and raw. "I am terrified, but I am also tired of splitting my time between two places, tired of saying goodbye every few days. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life with you, not just a house." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But if that is not what you want, if I am asking too much, it is exactly what I want," Ethan said, and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I love you, Ragna. I have loved you for months now, and I want nothing more than to live here with you and build a life together." She pulled back just enough to stare at him. "You love me? Is that really a surprise?" He smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You are brave and brilliant and beautiful, and you make me happier than I ever thought I could be. Of course I love you." Ragna let out a choked laugh and kissed him hard, pouring everything she felt into the touch. When they broke apart, she was grinning through her tears. "I love you too," she said, the words fierce and certain. "I did not think I would ever say that to anyone, but I do. I love you, Ethan Quinlan, you impossible, wonderful human." They finished the house by the first snowfall, working with a renewed energy and purpose that carried them through the long days and cold nights. When the last shingle was nailed into place and the last window fitted into its frame, they stood back and looked at what they had built together. And Ethan felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with the structure itself, and everything to do with what it represented. They moved Ethan's belongings from the cabin over the course of a week, packing up his life and transporting it piece by piece to their new home. He sold his sheep to a farmer in the nearest settlement, claiming that he was moving farther into the mountains and could not manage a flock alone. It was not quite a lie, and the farmer did not ask too many questions, which suited Ethan just fine. The day they officially moved into the house, Ragna cooked a celebratory meal, and they ate it at the table they had built together, in the home they had built together. And Ethan thought that he had never been happier or more content. But their peace was not to last. The trouble started in the early spring, when hunters from the nearest settlement ventured into the mountains in search of game. Ethan had been in town to buy supplies when he overheard two men talking about strange signs they had found: orc tracks, a cleared building site, evidence of habitation in an area that was supposed to be wilderness. His blood ran cold. They were talking about Ragna's valley, about their home. He finished his business as quickly as possible and rode back to the valley at a pace that left his horse lathered and blowing. Ragna met him at the door, taking one look at his face and immediately arming herself. "What happened?" she demanded. "Hunters," Ethan said, swinging down from the saddle. "They have found signs of you, of us. They are talking about coming back with more men to investigate." Ragna's face went hard. "How long do we have?" "I do not know. A few days, maybe a week." "But Ragna, they will not come alone, and they will not come peacefully. If they find you here, they will see it as a threat. They will try to drive you out or worse." "Let them try," she said, her voice cold. "This is my home, our home. I am not leaving." "I am not asking you to leave," Ethan said, taking her hands. "But we need a plan. We need to be smart about this." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Ethan rode back to his old cabin and left signs of habitation there, building up the fiction that he still lived alone and had simply sold his sheep to focus on trapping and hunting. Ragna, meanwhile, hid or disguised the more obvious signs of her presence around the valley, covering tracks, stashing supplies, making the house look more like a hunter's temporary shelter than a permanent dwelling. The hunters arrived 4 days later, a group of 6 men armed with rifles and bows. Ethan met them at the edge of the valley, keeping himself between them and the house, his own rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone friendly but firm. The leader, a grizzled man named Marcus, whom Ethan vaguely recognized from the settlement, squinted at him. "You are Quinlan, right? Used to have the sheep up on the eastern ridge." "That is right. I sold the flock and moved deeper into the mountains. Better hunting here." Ethan smiled, easy and unconcerned. "What brings you all the way out here?" "We have been tracking an orc," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the valley behind Ethan. "Found signs of habitation building. Thought maybe we had a raiding party setting up a base." "An orc?" Ethan laughed, carefully calibrated. "Out here, I have not seen any orcs since I moved. Plenty of deer and wolves, but no orcs." "You sure about that?" Another hunter stepped forward, suspicious. "Because those tracks we found were fresh. And that building we spotted does not look like any animal den I have ever seen." "Building?" Ethan frowned, feigning confusion. "You must mean the old trapper's cabin about a mile north of here. It has been abandoned for years, but the structure is still mostly sound. I have been using it to store supplies." "Is that what you saw?" The hunters exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Marcus frowned. "Maybe. We did not get close enough to check properly, but if you are living out here, you need to be careful, Quinlan. There have been reports of orc activity in these mountains, and the settlement council is talking about organizing a militia to clear them out." Ethan's stomach dropped, but he kept his face neutral. "I appreciate the warning, but like I said, I have not seen anything. If that changes, I will be sure to let someone know." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we will take you at your word, but we will be keeping an eye on this area just in case. You watch yourself, you hear?" "Will do," Ethan said, and watched as the hunters turned and made their way back out of the valley. He waited until they were completely out of sight before returning to the house, where Ragna was waiting by the window with her bow in hand. "They are gone," he said. "For now." "They will be back," Ragna said flatly. "If not them, then others. Humans do not let things go, Ethan. They will keep searching, keep pushing until they find me. Then we deal with it when they come." Ethan crossed to her and took her hands, gripping them tightly. "But we are not giving up our home without a fight. We have as much right to be here as anyone." "You have a right," Ragna corrected, her voice bitter. "I am just a monster squatting on land that humans think belongs to them. That is not true, and you know it." Ethan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "This valley was empty when you found it. You built a life here. You have done nothing wrong. That will not matter if they decide I am a threat." She closed her eyes, her voice cracking. "Ethan, I cannot lose this. I cannot lose you. But I do not know how to keep both." "We will figure it out," he promised. "Together. We always do." Over the following weeks, the tension in the valley became a constant, oppressive presence. Ethan made regular trips to the settlement to keep up appearances and gather information, and what he learned was not encouraging. The council was indeed organizing a militia, driven by fear, and rumors of orc aggression that Ethan suspected were exaggerated at best. There was talk of sweeping the mountains, clearing out any orc presence to make the area safe for expansion and settlement. He tried to argue against it, carefully and indirectly, but he was one voice among many, and most of the settlers had only ever known orcs as enemies. They could not imagine, or would not imagine, that an orc might simply want to live in peace. Ragna, for her part, grew increasingly withdrawn and defensive. She spent hours every day patrolling the valley, checking for signs of intrusion, and she slept fitfully, waking at every sound. Ethan did his best to reassure her, but he could feel the stress taking its toll on both of them. The breaking point came on a cold morning in late spring, when Ethan returned from the settlement to find Ragna standing in front of their house with her pack at her feet and tears streaming down her face. "I am leaving," she said before he could speak. "I have to. If I stay, I put you in danger. If the militia comes and finds me here with you, they will call you a traitor. They will hurt you, maybe kill you. I cannot let that happen." "No." Ethan dismounted and strode toward her, his heart pounding. "Absolutely not. We are not doing this. We do not have a choice." Ragna's voice broke. "I love you too much to let you throw your life away for me. You have to let me go, Ethan. You have to." He kissed her, hard and desperate, cutting off her words. When he pulled back, his hands were shaking as he cupped her face. "I am not letting you go," he said fiercely. "I do not care what the militia does or what the settlers think. You are my home, Ragna, not this valley, not the house, you. And if I have to choose between you and them, I will choose you every single time. You cannot mean that. I have never meant anything more." He rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming hard. "I left the army because I was tired of fighting for things I did not believe in. I moved to the mountains because I wanted a life that was mine, on my terms. And I fell in love with you because you are the bravest, most honorable person I have ever met, and you make me want to be better." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "I am not going to let fear and prejudice take that away from me, from us. So if you leave, I am coming with you. And we will keep running until we find a place where no one cares what we are or who we love. But I am not giving you up." Ragna stared at him, her eyes wide and overflowing with tears. "You are truly impossible," she whispered. Then she was kissing him, clutching at him like he was the only solid thing in the world, and he held her just as tightly. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, and when they finally broke apart, Ragna's face was set with a determination that Ethan recognized and loved. "If we are going to stay, we need to be smart," she said. "No more hiding, no more pretending. We tell the truth and we make them see that I am not a threat." "How?" Ethan asked. "By showing them." Ragna squared her shoulders. "By helping them. The next time there is trouble, wolves, bandits, whatever, I will deal with it. Publicly. I will prove that I am not their enemy and you will vouch for me. It might not change everyone's mind, but it might change enough." It was a risky plan and they both knew it. But it was also the only plan they had that did not involve running or fighting or giving up, and so they committed to it. Their opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, word spread through the settlement that a group of bandits had been harassing travelers on the main road, robbing them and occasionally turning violent. The militia was still being organized, and in the meantime, the settlers were frightened and angry and looking for someone to blame. Ethan heard about it during one of his supply runs and immediately returned to the valley to tell Ragna. They spent the evening planning, and the next morning they set out together to track the bandits. It took them 2 days to find the camp, a ramshackle collection of tents and stolen goods hidden in a rocky defile about 10 miles from the settlement. There were 8 bandits in total, all of them armed and dangerous, and Ethan felt his old military instincts kicking in as he and Ragna crouched in the underbrush and surveyed the camp. "We cannot take them all at once," Ragna murmured, her eyes scanning the layout. "Too many, too spread out. We need to separate them." "Agreed." Ethan pointed to a narrow trail leading away from the camp. "If we make noise there, some of them will come to investigate. We take them out quietly, then move on to the next group." They worked together with a precision that came from months of trust and partnership, dividing and isolating the bandits before taking them down one by one. Ragna was a force of nature in a fight, fast and strong and utterly unrelenting, and Ethan found himself falling into the rhythm of supporting her, covering her blind spots, watching her back. By the time the last bandit fell, both of them were breathing hard and sporting minor injuries, but they were victorious. They tied up the unconscious bandits, gathered the stolen goods, and began the long trek back to the settlement. They arrived just after dawn, Ragna leading the way with her head held high and Ethan at her side. The sight of them drew immediate attention: an orc woman and a human man, bloodied and battered, dragging 8 bound bandits and carrying sacks of recovered goods. Marcus and several other settlers came rushing out, weapons drawn, but Ethan stepped forward with his hands raised. "Before you do anything," he called out, his voice carrying across the square, "you should know that this orc woman just saved your settlement. Those bandits on the road. We tracked them down and brought them in. The stolen goods are here. Your people are safe." The crowd murmured, uncertain. Marcus looked from Ethan to Ragna and back again, his expression unreadable. "What is going on here, Quinlan? Why are you traveling with an orc?" "Because she is my partner," Ethan said simply. "And because she is not your enemy. She has been living in the mountains for years, peacefully, bothering no one. When she heard about the bandits, she volunteered to help, and she risked her life to protect people who have never shown her anything but hatred and fear." He looked around at the crowd, meeting as many eyes as he could. "I know what you have been taught about orcs. I was taught the same things. But this orc, Ragna, has shown me more honor and courage and compassion than most humans I have known, and if you give her a chance, she will show you the same." The silence that followed was thick and tense. Then, slowly, an older woman stepped forward from the crowd. Ethan recognized her as the healer, a respected figure in the settlement. "Is it true?" she asked, addressing Ragna directly. "Did you do this to help us?" Ragna met her gaze steadily. Yes, I do not want conflict with your people. I want to live in peace. But peace requires trust on both sides, and I am willing to earn yours if you are willing to give me the chance. The healer studied her for a long moment, then turned to Marcus. I say we give her the chance. She brought back our people's property and captured dangerous criminals. That counts for something. Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable, but he nodded slowly. All right. For now, we will accept your help, Orc, but if there is any sign of trouble, any hint that you are a threat, we will not hesitate to act. Understood? Understood, Ragna said. It was not a warm welcome, and it was far from full acceptance, but it was a start. The settlers took custody of the bandits and the stolen goods, and over the following days, word of what Ragna had done spread through the settlement and beyond. Opinions were mixed. Some people remained deeply distrustful. Others were cautiously grateful, and a few even went so far as to thank her directly when they encountered her in town. Ethan and Ragna continued to live in their valley, but the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer hiding, and Ragna began making occasional trips to the settlement with Ethan, always cautious but no longer invisible. She helped track down a lost child who had wandered into the forest, assisted with a difficult birth when the healer needed extra hands, and even stepped in to stop a fire that threatened to consume a barn. Slowly, grudgingly, the settlement began to accept her presence. Not everyone, and not all at once, but enough that the constant fear and tension began to ease. It was during one of these visits, nearly a year after the bandit incident, that Marcus approached Ethan and Ragna in the settlement square. He looked uncomfortable but determined, and he cleared his throat before speaking. I owe you an apology, he said, addressing Ragna directly. Both of you, I was wrong about you. I let fear and old prejudices cloud my judgment, and I nearly made a terrible mistake because of it. He held out his hand. Thank you for everything you have done for us, and I am sorry it took me so long to see it. Ragna stared at his hand for a moment, then reached out and took it. Apology accepted, she said, and there was a cautious warmth in her voice. Thank you for giving me a chance. Marcus smiled, small but genuine, and shook her hand firmly. Then he nodded to Ethan and walked away, leaving them standing together in the square. Ethan looked at Ragna, and she looked back at him, and they both started laughing, the sound bright and disbelieving and full of relief. We did it, Ragna said, shaking her head. I cannot believe it, but we actually did it. Of course we did, Ethan replied, pulling her into a hug. We are a good team. The best, she agreed, and kissed him right there in the middle of the square, not caring who saw. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Ethan and Ragna split their time between their valley home and the settlement, becoming familiar faces in both places. They were not universally loved, and there were still people who looked at them with suspicion or disapproval, but they had carved out a space for themselves, a life that was theirs on their own terms. 2 years after the bandit incident, on a warm summer evening, Ethan asked Ragna to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains, and he had been working up the courage all day. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring that he had commissioned from the settlement blacksmith, a band of silver engraved with interlocking patterns that represented both human and orc craftsmanship. Ragna, he said, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. I know that marriage between humans and orcs is not exactly common, and I know that there will be people who do not approve. But I do not care about them. I care about you. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you, whatever that looks like. He held out the ring. Will you marry me? Ragna stared at the ring, then at him, and her eyes filled with tears. Yes, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, you impossible, wonderful man. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him into a kiss that was fierce and tender and full of promise. When they broke apart, she was grinning through her tears. "We are going to have to plan a wedding," she said, half laughing. "How does one even plan a wedding for a human and an orc?" "Very carefully," Ethan replied, grinning back. "But we will figure it out. We always do." The wedding took place 3 months later in the valley that had become their home. It was a small ceremony, attended by a handful of settlers who had become genuine friends, along with the settlement healer who agreed to officiate. Ragna wore a dress that she had made herself, a beautiful blend of human and orc styles, and Ethan wore his best clothes, simple but carefully chosen. They exchanged vows under the open sky, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. There were tears and laughter and a feast afterward that lasted well into the night, and when it was all over and the guests had gone home, Ethan and Ragna stood together in front of their house and looked at the life they had built. "You ever regret it?" Ragna asked softly. "Choosing me over the easier path?" "Never," Ethan said, wrapping his arms around her. "Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Ragna, and I would choose you again and again in every life, in every world." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he replied. "Always." The years that followed were not without their difficulties. There were still people who disapproved of their relationship, still moments of tension and conflict. But there were also moments of joy and triumph, of quiet domesticity and shared adventures. They built a life together, brick by brick and day by day, and it was not perfect, but it was theirs. Ragna eventually became a respected figure in the settlement, known for her skill as a tracker and her willingness to help when needed. Ethan continued his work as a shepherd and hunter, and together they became a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. 5 years after their wedding, Ragna gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful child with her mother's green skin and pointed ears and her father's warm eyes. They named her Alara, and she grew up in the valley, surrounded by love and the knowledge that she was the living proof that humans and orcs could not only coexist, but thrive together. As Ethan held his daughter for the first time, Ragna beside him on their bed, he thought back to that cold dawn when an orc woman had dragged a dead wolf onto his porch and told him it had been near his sheep. He thought about all the choices that had led them here, all the risks and fears and leaps of faith, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would not change a single moment. "Thank you," he said softly, looking at Ragna. "For what?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from Alara's tiny face. "For trusting me, for giving me a chance, for loving me enough to stay." He kissed her gently, "For everything." Ragna smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "Not as an orc or an enemy or a monster, but as me, just me." "Always," Ethan promised. "Always just you." And as the sun set over the mountains and their daughter slept peacefully between them, Ethan and Ragna looked toward the future they had built together, full of hope and love and the unshakable certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because that was what they did. That was who they were, a human and an orc, a shepherd and a hunter, a husband and a wife, a father and a mother. But most importantly, two people who had found each other against all odds and chosen, every single day, to love each other despite the world's expectations. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mix of challenges and blessings. Alara grew into a bright, curious child who inherited her mother's strength and her father's gentle heart. She learned to track game with Ragna and to raid and write with Ethan, and she became a beloved figure in the settlement, her very existence a testament to the possibility of peace between humans and orcs. When she was 7 years old, Alara asked her parents about the prejudice she sometimes encountered, the whispered comments and wary looks from some of the older settlers. "Why do some people not like me?" she asked one evening, her voice small and confused. Ethan and Ragna exchanged a look, and then Ragna knelt down to be at eye level with her daughter. "Some people are afraid of things they do not understand," she said gently. "They see that you are different, that your mother is an orc and your father is a human, and it scares them because it challenges what they have always believed." "But that is not fair," Alara protested. "No, it is not," Ethan agreed, joining them. "But fairness is something we have to work for, every day. Your mother and I have spent years showing people that orcs and humans can live together in peace. And you, just by being yourself, are showing them that our two peoples can create something beautiful together." "So I just have to keep being me?" Alara asked. "Exactly," Ragna said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Just keep being you, kind and brave and strong. And eventually, people will see what we see, that you are perfect exactly as you are." Alara seemed to accept this, and as she grew older, she became increasingly confident in her identity, proud of her heritage rather than ashamed of it. She made friends easily, both human and orc children from the few other mixed families that had begun to form in the region, and she became a voice for understanding and acceptance in a world that still struggled with both. By the time Alara reached adulthood, the landscape had begun to shift. More orcs and humans were forming relationships, cautiously at first but with increasing openness as they saw examples like Ethan and Ragna. The settlement that had once viewed Ragna with suspicion now had several orc families living within its borders, contributing to the community and slowly breaking down the barriers of fear and hatred. It was not a perfect transformation, and there were still holdouts who clung to old prejudices. But it was progress, real and tangible, and Ethan and Ragna watched it happen with a sense of quiet pride. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their home, now expanded and improved over the years, and looked out at the valley that had become not just their sanctuary, but a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Ethan asked, his arm around Ragna's waist. "How could I forget?" Ragna replied, leaning into him. "You looked so terrified, standing there in your nightshirt with your rifle shaking in your hands." "I was terrified," Ethan admitted with a laugh. "I thought you were going to kill me." "I thought you were going to shoot me," Ragna countered. "We were both idiots, the best kind of idiots," Ethan said and kissed her temple. "I am glad you dragged that wolf onto my porch." "I am glad you invited me to dinner," Ragna said softly. "I am glad for all of it. Every moment, every choice, every risk, because it led us here to this life, to this love, and I would not trade it for anything." "Neither would I," Ethan said. "Not for all the peace and safety and acceptance in the world. Because none of that would mean anything without you." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Around them, the valley hummed with life, the sound of their daughter laughing somewhere inside the house, the distant bleat of sheep in the pasture, the rustle of wind through the trees. It was a symphony of peace and belonging, hard-won and deeply cherished. And as Ethan looked at Ragna, at the woman who had come into his life on a cold dawn morning with a dead wolf and a wary expression, he felt a profound gratitude for every choice that had led them to this moment. For the courage it had taken to trust a stranger, to open his heart, to fight for a love that the world said was impossible, because in the end it had not been impossible at all. It had been difficult, yes, painful at times, frightening, but also beautiful and worthwhile and absolutely, completely worth fighting for. "I love you," he said, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I love you too," Ragna replied, and kissed him as the stars wheeled overhead and their home glowed warm with light and life behind them. And in that moment, in that place, with that love, everything was exactly as it should be. The story of Ethan and Ragna became something of a legend in the region, told and retold around fires and in taverns, evolving with each telling but always maintaining the core truth that love could bridge even the deepest divides, and that courage and compassion could change the world, one small act at a time. Their daughter Alara grew up to become a diplomat of sorts, traveling between human and orc communities and helping to negotiate peaceful settlements and mutual understanding. She married a human man who loved her fiercely and accepted her heritage without reservation, and together they had children of their own, further blurring the lines between orc and human, until those distinctions began to matter less and less. Ethan and Ragna lived long, full lives in their valley home, growing old together with a grace and contentment that came from knowing they had lived according to their own values, regardless of the cost. They watched their grandchildren grow, saw the world around them slowly transform into something kinder and more accepting, and took quiet satisfaction in knowing that they had been part of that transformation. On a warm autumn day, many years after that first dawn meeting, Ethan and Ragna sat together on their porch one final time. They were old now, their bodies marked by age and hard work, but their love was as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger for having been tested and proven over decades. "Do you have any regrets?" Ethan asked, his hand clasped in hers. Ragna was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she shook her head. "None, you, not one," Ethan said, and smiled at her, the expression warm and peaceful. "It has been a good life. The best life," Ragna agreed. "Thank you for sharing it with me." "Thank you for dragging that wolf onto my porch," Ethan said, and they both laughed, the sound soft and full of memory. As the sun set over the mountains one last time, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan and Ragna sat together in the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created, and felt nothing but gratitude and love and peace. Their story did not end with tragedy or drama, but with contentment and fulfillment, 2 lives well lived and a love that had changed the world simply by refusing to be denied. And in the generations that followed, when people spoke of the shepherd and the orc who had bridged 2 worlds, they spoke with reverence and hope, knowing that if Ethan and Ragna could find love and peace in the midst of fear and hatred, then perhaps anyone could. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the greatest legacy of all.